Over 100 schools had to be shut down over safety concerns that the school buildings might collapse due to the bad concrete. Whose fault is this? Does the Conservative Party have anything to do with it, or is it just a huge mistake?
Well, I think this is a fault all governments actually, going back because this started it was first raised in 2008, and Labour was still in power in 2008. So that's when it very first started, and then since then we've had a coalition, and the Conservatives still in power, and we've still got aerated concrete that's dangerous. So the problem really is the Conservatives' problem at the moment, and how they're going to deal with it. And it's all about the timing as well, because it needs to be swift. They can't drag their feet with it and start pointing the finger now. Take ownership of it, move on, get it sorted out.
Because Jeremy Hunt went on and said we'll put whatever resources and whatever money has to be in.
Well, let's see how that materialises. We still see cladding on buildings where they've dragged their feet with that, and then who's going to pay for it? Government says, we will pay for it, but someone's going to be accountable for it at the end of the day. Probably a similar situation with the school buildings, but we don't have the luxury of time with this. Really, we need to act on it now, and just take ownership of it and get the job done. I think that'll do better.
I find myself agreeing with Stephen again. You can't ask any more than that for a Conservative to say we're in government, we have to take responsibility. There are a few things that are more important than this. The resources have to be found, and we need a programme to manage change. I think the problem always is going to be from government is even if the Chancellor says, I'm making the money available, will the Department for Education have the right project management infrastructure in place to be able to enable this to happen school by school in every part of the country? And to be frank with you, that's going to be the challenge. Ministers make these statements, and then 6 months, 12 months, 2 years later, people on the ground say nothing's happened in our school, nothing's happened in our community. Yeah. So what also has to happen simultaneously is within the Department for Education, there needs to be a project management team set up, and there needs to be literally a plan school by school, community by community, and then we'll see delivery. If that doesn't happen, it just won't happen. And then, of course, the government will be held to account in the next election, in the run-up to the next election, because people will see, here's an example of things being promised and not being delivered. And that's fatal for any government.
Well, that's an interesting point, that, Ivan, because they need to act really now, and it all needs to be sorted out before Christmas time, really. So, the project team, can they rely on the staff that's underneath them and get them motivated to do what they're meant to do? That's a good key point, that.
Yeah. Have they set up these teams?
We don't know that. I mean, probably the answer is they'll be scrambling. As a former minister, they'll be scrambling around this weekend, realising this has become a very, very big public interest issue, because you can imagine parents and grandparents' reaction to this, as well as teachers and head teachers. So this has become a very public, high-profile public issue. So I would imagine the government will be scrambling around now to make this a top priority within government. And I'm sure they'll be trying to do that. The question is whether once you move on from this high-profile, leading the news, big story.
Well, it's led the news It's led the news for a couple of days.
Yeah, so
let's just see how that carries on. The news would be a big part of this as well, because if they keep the teeth into it this week, then there's more urgency with the whole thing then.
Yeah, I mean, I understand Stephen's point about it first materialising in 2008. And Labour were in power from 2008 to 2010.
Did it materialise?
But we are 15 years on.
When they did do the building, was Labour in power then?
I don't know. It's almost irrelevant. I mean,
you're going to have changes.
I don't think you can blame a Conservative minister or a Labour minister for what happened in terms of the building work. The question is when it becomes clear that terrible mistakes have been made that risk children's health, that you do something about it.
Yeah.
By the way, I just think we've got to be realistic. The idea that politicians are sat there supervising every building project in detail, that's not the case. Yeah. Clearly, if there are endemic problems in major government infrastructure projects, ministers have to take responsibility, okay. But I suspect here it wasn't quite like that. So the issue, as Stephen's quite rightly said, is we now know it's a big problem, we now know there are real safety concerns, and the government needs to get a grip on it.